In 2019, veganism was ready to go mainstream. Beyond Meat had the most successful IPO since the 2008 financial crisis, major fast food chains were rushing to add plant-based options to their menus, and environmental concerns put animal agriculture in the spotlight. But then the pandemic hit and everything started to change. As people became isolated, online radicalization accelerated. Supply chain disruptions led to meat shortages, which sparked panic and fear about food security. The pandemic also amplified existing divisions between urban and rural America. While coastal cities embraced lockdowns and mask mandates, many rural areas resisted restrictions as government overreach. This further cemented the narrative of rural America as the real America, tough, self-sufficient, and unwilling to be controlled. In this environment, traditional masculinity, associated with meat consumption and self-reliance, became even more appealing to those who felt powerless during quarantine. No one exemplifies this change in values better than Joe Rogan, who used to consider himself a liberal. During COVID, Joe moved to Austin and began shifting toward the far right. In this video, we're going to analyze Joe's conversation with Taylor Sheridan, which isn't just a bad take on veganism, it's a fascinating showcase of how anti-vegan sentiment has become intertwined with fascist ideology in American culture. Before we dive in, let's clarify what I mean by fascism. I'm talking about a political ideology characterized by ultranationalism, traditional gender roles, glorification of violence, disdain for perceived weakness, and the elevation of dominant groups. Whether you're vegan, omnivore, or somewhere in between, this analysis will help you understand how anti-vegan rhetoric functions as a gateway to more extreme right-wing ideologies and how traditional values are being weaponized against environmental and animal rights movements. But first, who is Taylor Sheridan? If you haven't heard of him, then you must not have a conservative uncle in the United States. He created Yellowstone, a drama about ranchers that was the most watched show in America in 2022. But Yellowstone isn't just entertainment, it's propaganda for a particular vision of America, where rural, white, gun-owning men are the last defenders of real American values against urban progressives, environmentalists, and indigenous people. Not only is Taylor Sheridan a screenwriter, but he owns 2 mega ranches in Texas, and starts this discussion by complaining about how naive city folk don't understand where food comes from.
And then you come to these big urban centers where people do not understand where their food comes from.
Right.
I read an article, this is when I lived in LA as an actor, and there was some uproar. Some cheerleader had gone hunting and killed a deer or something. And there was this massive, people went nuts. One of them said that all hunters should be killed. How dare they go out and kill that animal? Why can't they just go get their food at the grocery store where it's made?
There's just one little problem with Taylor's rendition of this story. She wasn't hunting deer, she was hunting lions, zebras, and other animals that most people don't think we should kill. But the truth doesn't matter here. What matters is creating a narrative of persecution, a core fascist tactic where the dominant group positions itself as victimized by imaginary enemies. That being said, I do agree with Taylor and Joe that people have no idea where meat comes from. The average person rarely thinks about the animals they eat. And while I obviously disagree with hunting, I do think shooting a deer in the wild is more ethical than paying for animals to live on torture factories where they never see sunlight until the day they're forced onto a truck and taken to a slaughterhouse. But most people don't hunt, and if they did, we'd run out of wild animals in a matter of months. This is the critical contradiction in Taylor and Joe's worldview. They promote an unscalable lifestyle while using it to criticize possible solutions like a plant-based food system.
I had conversations with people while they're eating meat saying I could never hunt. Like, I don't know how you do it. Like, what are you talking about? You're eating meat. You just hired a supermarket hitman.
Yeah,
like,
you just exported the execution.
I find it interesting that Joe and Taylor frame buying meat as hiring a hitman or exporting the execution. They're using language that implies they do think animals are sentient individuals. The fascist mindset often acknowledges the suffering it causes, but reframes it as necessary natural, and honorable.
And I'd come back to Texas and hunt for a weekend, go shoot 3 deer, and that's a
Yeah.
year's worth of food.
Right.
Three animals for a year.
Taylor says you can kill 3 animals and live on them for a year, but the math doesn't add up. If you can get about 58 pounds of meat from 1 deer, and each pound has 750 calories, then 1 animal yields 41,000 calories, so you'd get 123,000 calories a year, which breaks down to 336 calories per day. That's certainly not enough to live on, especially if you eat a lot of meat. This disregard for factual accuracy is another fascist trait. What matters isn't truth, but the emotional resonance of the claim. The idea of a self-sufficient hunter living off the land has mythological power, so it doesn't matter if it's mathematically impossible. Throughout this conversation, Joe and Taylor continue to imply that people who live in cities don't understand the real world and are detached from nature.
But most people are just so disconnected from it and so connected to the urban world where no one's growing anything. Everything has to be brought in by trucks.
Never mind that cities offer more opportunities for employment and networking, and Joe and Taylor both spent decades in urban environments before building their rural empires. They eventually discuss hunting and bond over their willingness to dominate nature,
Have you ever eaten beaver?
No.
It's good.
sharing stories of the native animals they love to eat.
I've eaten a lot of feral hogs. Yeah. I shot
hey,
one at Tejon, turned it into sausage.
Did you?
It's good. Yeah.
Those things are a problem. I mean, they're
a real problem out here.
Oh my gosh, and the destruction that they reap on the ecosystem. I mean, that's the reason the bobwhite quail population has just plummeted. Rattlesnakes have stopped rattling.
Because of the hogs? Wow.
They position hunting as noble because Taylor claims that wild hogs are a problem for quails and rattlesnakes. It is true that they've hurt quail populations, but there's no evidence that they damage rattlesnakes. The idea that rattlesnakes are evolving to stop rattling is a common myth from an NPR article. Taylor's inability to verify claims he sees on the internet will become more apparent throughout the rest of this conversation, and this pattern of spreading misinformation while positioning yourself as an authority is classic far-right communication where truth is disregarded to reinforce the ideological narrative. Eventually, Taylor brings up veganism.
I think one of the most absurd positions anyone can take is they're a vegan for an ethical reason. It's preposterous. You could do it for a medical reason, even though I don't know what that reason would be, but maybe you can't process meat, you can't process proteins like that. But to do it from an ethical reason is absurd.
Saying that it's preposterous to be vegan for ethical issues reveals a complete misunderstanding of veganism, which is an ethical philosophy to avoid animal exploitation. If you follow a vegan diet for health, you could still buy leather or wear fur, so you wouldn't be vegan, you would be plant-based. But more importantly, notice how they frame compassion as absurd. This mockery of empathy is central to fascist rhetoric. Caring for the vulnerable is portrayed as naive at best and degenerate at worst. Real men dominate, they don't nurture.
To do it from an ethical reason is absurd. And the reason I say that is I have plowed a field. It is carnage. And every single plant that you eat is going to be tilled into the ground in some capacity. So you're going to kill everything.
It would be so nice if I could go a day, just one day, without addressing the crop deaths argument. But I've been involved in animal rights long enough to know that's just never going to happen. Let's start with the basics. It's not true that more animals are killed for plant farming than animal farming. Even if it were true, animals eat so many plants that, due to basic biology, using crops to feed animals and then kill and eat them will always kill more plants than if you eat plants directly. But the more relevant answer is that veganism isn't about reducing the number of deaths in the world. It's about rejecting the speciesist worldview, which says that animals are objects we can use. The scientific evidence is clear that animals are sentient individuals who suffer and feel pain, and that we don't need to eat animal products to survive and thrive. Considering how often Joe talks about veganism, you would think he might have a basic understanding of it by now, but you would be wrong.
If you want to kill the most things, become a vegan.
Yeah, 100%.
If you're thinking about individual life, if you don't think that one life equals one life, if you think that small things aren't as valuable as large things, that's a totally different discussion, and that's a weird discussion. But if you think that all life is sacred, well, what about the lives of The ground nesting birds, fawns, all those things are getting demolished.
He thinks that vegans think all life is sacred, and there are probably certain religious subsets of veganism that do come from that worldview, but most of us don't. We don't think we're causing zero deaths. We don't think we're perfect. We just reject the idea of human supremacy and think the world would be better if we evolved away from using animals as resources. Fascism depends on the concept of natural hierarchies, that some beings are meant to dominate others. By questioning human supremacy, veganism threatens this entire worldview, which explains some of the backlash toward plant-based and lab-grown meat, with conservative states already attempting to ban it.
The average organic avocado farm in Central California is going to kill, on average, around 19,000 ground squirrels a year.
Taylor claims that the average avocado farm kills 19,000 squirrels a year, but he got that number from a random tweet that doesn't have a source, once again revealing his inability to recognize misinformation. Here's a chart of animals killed during slaughter and harvest for food production, and we can see the plant-based foods have the lowest numbers. But once again, just because some animals accidentally die during harvest doesn't justify intentionally breeding and killing them, in the same way that just because humans die in accidents doesn't mean it's okay to murder. Next, Taylor brings up the bee argument, which is a basic appeal to futility. He's saying that since we can't be perfect, we may as well not even try.
That's not counting the billions of bees, because they're going to bring the bees up from Brazil to pollinate the trees, and then they're going to fucking die. They're not sending them back anywhere. They're not keeping them in some, no, they're gone.
This is just a dishonest attempt to undermine veganism. It's not an argument, it's armor designed to protect fragile worldviews from critical examination. There's this great Upton St. Clair quote which says, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." And that's exactly what we're seeing here. Neither Joe nor Taylor are making a genuine attempt to understand veganism. Joe's hunting trips and Taylor's Yellowstone empire both revolve around romanticizing a relationship with animals that requires their exploitation. When your brand, your identity, and your bank account are all built on the speciesist view of animals, you're not going to put much effort into analyzing it. This fusion of economic interest with cultural identity is exactly how the far-right ideology builds its base, by convincing people that their economic and cultural safety are under attack by progressive movements like veganism.
If you look anywhere in the ecosystem, take man out of it, virtually everything is living at the expense of another organism. If a certain weed grows up over the grass, it's killing the grass.
Taylor goes on to say that life requires death and conflates non-sentient plants with sentient animals. We just live in a competitive world and we have to kill to survive, so why not breed animals just to slaughter them? This competitive worldview gained popularity during the Industrial Revolution and was used to justify exploitation under the banner of survival of the fittest. Taylor's spouting social Darwinism, which is based on a myopic view of ecology. When you actually look at complex organisms in the biosphere, cooperation is much more prevalent than competition.
There is not a vegan fish. There's not a vegetarian fish. Every single fish, every frog, they're eating another organism to survive.
So humans can't be vegan because fish eat other fish and plants to survive. They then excuse human violence by saying that chimps are violent too.
If you ever wonder where our
alive.
violent streak comes from, watch chimpanzees.
I wonder if they think infanticide is okay because other animals eat their babies. This appeal to nature is one of the most common fascist arguments, that violence is natural and therefore good. It's the same logic that's been used to justify everything from slavery to sexism to genocide.
That's the real nature. That's not vegan nature. That's not this bullshit utopian artificial paradise that people have created in their mind that they're doing if they're eating vegan.
Once again, they paint vegans as overly emotional babies who just don't understand nature. Look, we know nature is cruel, but fail to see how that justifies exploiting animals when we don't need to. Notice how this conversation frames empathy and moral consideration as feminine, weak, and childish. This gendering of violence as masculine is an authoritarian tactic for recruiting young men into their ideology, which clearly worked based on how many young men voted for Trump in 2024. largely due to Rogan's endorsement.
Unless you're growing all of your own food in your yard. If that's not the case, you're involved in murder.
Joe says if you're not growing your own food, then you have no room to talk, once again highlighting values of self-reliance. But Taylor quickly jumps in with more appeals to futility.
Even then, you don't think you're going to have what happens when the grasshoppers come.
Right.
And they'll get through that fence.
He then goes on a rant about almonds, and I'm just so upset that Joe is making all these nut puns without even realizing it.
One almond takes 3 gallons.
Isn't
Now,
that
how many
nuts?
almonds does one almond tree have? 10,000? We'll do the math.
It's nuts. Nothing makes me crack up more than the stop oil people when they're blocking the highway with clothes made with oil.
Then Joe uses the oil industry's favorite argument against climate activists. He's saying you shouldn't fight against the oil industry if you use fossil fuels. But I wonder if he would have said that abolitionists shouldn't fight to end slavery if they were consuming slave-made goods. Would he have wanted fewer people trying to end slavery? It's basically impossible to exist in our world without using fossil fuels, and the oil companies know it. That's why they popularized the idea of a carbon footprint, because they know individual action doesn't threaten their profits. Meanwhile, the meat industry knows that individual change could affect their profits, so they've spent millions on misinformation designed to keep people eating meat and dunking on vegans, which Joe and Taylor are happy to do for free. I think the most revealing aspect of this conversation is how desperately they cling to meat consumption as a cornerstone of their manhood. This hyper-masculine posturing isn't just about food. It's about constructing an identity that depends on domination of nature, of animals, and ultimately of other humans who are deemed less worthy. This is why veganism triggers such visceral reactions from men like Joe and Taylor. It challenges not just what they eat, but who they believe themselves to be. As traditional power structures face challenges from movements promoting equality, sustainability, and compassion, we're seeing a strong backlash based on fear of change. Shows like Yellowstone and the Joe Rogan Experience are venues where these ideologies are normalized and infiltrate American society. This explains why we've seen a rise in homesteaders, carnivore influencers, cowboy culture, and tradwives. But I'm curious what you think. Did you like this conversation with Taylor and Joe? Have you noticed any of these patterns in anti-vegan arguments? Let me know in the comments, and if you want to support my work, please donate to my Patreon or Pro Animal Future. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.